Hello, and welcome to Tales from the Viking Age. Now, in this first video, I'm going to be talking about the Vikings in general. Yes, indeed, the Vikings. They who sailed around in fancy-looking ships with dragon heads on them while committing all sorts of unspeakably nefarious deeds. Or at least that's the popular image of them. But there's a problem with that. The problem is that image, popular though it may be, is completely wrong. But I hear you say, well, we all know about the Vikings. They were merciless murderers and rapists. Everyone knows that. Well, at one time, everyone also knew the earth was flat. But it wasn't. In their own day, the Vikings got what we'd call today a bad press. Historians of the time, usually Christian monks, since they were the only people generally able to read and write, gleefully writing down lurid accounts of Viking brutality, since they were pagans, while glossing over exactly the same things being done by Christians, beginning at a slanted view of the Vikings that has lingered right down to our own times. Say Vikings, and what instantly springs to mind? Non-stop savage brutality, 24/7, 365 days a year, raiding, looting, killing, raping, and burning things. But that's only a part of the picture, and an exaggerated part as well. There's a lot more to the Vikings than that. And without them, Europe would be a very different place today, because their influence was considerable across a wide range of things. Here in Ireland, for example, most of the major towns, including the capital Dublin, weren't founded by the native Irish. No, they were founded by the Vikings. So let's take a look at some of the real facts of the Viking Age, rather than the usual lurid and often inaccurate images of them. But of course, blood and guts and rampaging bearded men in horned helmets are so much more exciting than everyday domestic matters or cultural or social aspects. Bashing someone's head in with an axe is a more enthralling image than planting crops, fishing, or changing your clothes frequently, and certainly makes for more gripping footage in movies or TV shows. The so-called Viking Age is dated quite precisely, as commencing with the raid on the monastery located on the island of Lindisfarne in Northumbria on the 8th of June, 793 AD. And ending with the death of the great Norwegian king Harald Sigurdsson, better known as Harald Hardrada, which means Harold the Hard Ruler, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September 1066. Curious enough, both events taking place in England, far from the Scandinavian homeland of the Norse peoples. Of course, the Norse people didn't all magically appear from nowhere in June of 793, dragon-headed ships popping up all over the place, and then they all suddenly vanished in a puff of smoke in September of 1066. They'd existed long before and long after those very precise dates, but it makes for a convenient category to place the Vikings in for the purpose of historical reference. And, of course, it is related to the most well-known aspects of them as far as the general public are concerned: raiding, since it is dated from their first major raid. Not their first raid on England, there had been minor ones before that, but their first major one at Lindisfarne. Now, there's a very good reason for that raiding context. You see, Vikings did not exist before 793, nor after 1066. But wait, didn't I just mention the fact that the Norse people were around both before and after those dates? Yes, I did, because they were. But Vikings weren't. No. Confused? Well, the answer is quite simple. All Vikings were Norse, but not all Norse were Vikings. In fact, only a minority of Norsemen, and some women as well, were Vikings, but they didn't call themselves that most of the year. Generally, they were only called Vikings during the summer months. Actually, they never called themselves Vikings as a name, because they weren't. And even when they were, they still weren't actually Vikings as such. Now you're really confused, right? Well, let's just have an overall look at the people of Scandinavia in those times. The Norse people initially inhabited the lands of present-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, though those countries didn't exist in their modern form for much of the Viking Age, being comprised then of numerous kingdoms, earldoms, and so forth. And those people would later spread their influence out to the British Isles, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Ireland, the Orkneys and Shetland Islands, Greenland, France, the Isle of Man, what is now Russia, and even as far as Constantinople, as well as North America, 500 years before Columbus didn't discover it. Columbus never actually saw the North American mainland. No, he saw islands in the Caribbean. To say he discovered America would be like claiming someone discovered Spain by finding the Canary Islands. He didn't. The Vikings did. They were the finest navigators of their time. Their ships are a marvel of technology. They had some of the most advanced social ideas of the early Middle Ages and were the finest warriors of their time, even being hired by Byzantine Emperor Basil II to form his personal bodyguard, becoming the formidable Varangian Guard. And for most of the Viking Age, they were pagans, something closely connected with much of their culture and attitudes, until Christianity eventually replaced the gods of Asgard, the old religion having almost disappeared by the end of the 11th century. Yes, that's all right, that's all wonderful, but how, you ask, are the Vikings not Vikings? And even the ones who were Vikings for only part of the year, but didn't call themselves Vikings even when they were Vikings. Because the term Viking, or Vikinger, as it was in Old Norse, was not a term of nationality. A Norseman or a woman would have called themselves a Dane, a Norwegian, or a Swede. Those were their nationalities. Viking was a term that referred to those persons who went out in a ship to raid, trade, or later to settle abroad. In other words, to go Viking. So a Scandinavian couldn't be a Viking, but they could go Viking. Rather like a hiker can be someone of any nationality who simply goes out for a hike. You wouldn't call a German hiking through the Black Forest a hiker. He or she would still be a German who happened to be engaging in that activity. And if you asked them what they were, they'd say, I'm German. They're not going to say, I'm a hiker. If you could go back to, say, the 9th century, and you asked a man ploughing a field in Norway if he was a Vikinger, he'd probably say, of course not. Do you see a boat? How could I be going Vikinger when I'm here ploughing my field, you idiot? And since they tended to raid during the good weather in summer, which made sense, and return to Scandinavia or other bases elsewhere during the winter, they were, strictly speaking, only Vikings for part of the year. So, to be a Viking, you had to get into a ship and go somewhere and do something when you got there. If you didn't do any of those things, well, to use that lovely, famous Jewish joke, to you, you may be a Viking, but to a Viking, you ain't no Viking. That sums it up perfectly. In the popular television series, Vikings, the principal characters, Ragnar and Lagertha, are not Vikings at the start of episode 1. They are merely farmers. And Ragnar only becomes a Viking when he sails out in his ship to raid England. Lagertha only becoming one much later in the series when she joins him in a similar raid. But the moment both of them step back onto Scandinavian soil, leaving the ship behind, they are no longer Vikings. They are just farmers once again. There are various ideas on where the term Vikinger actually came from and its original true meaning, but it came to mean one who went raiding, a pirate, a seafarer, an explorer, even a settler, all rolled into one. But you know, another interesting thing about that is that nobody at that time used it to describe them, other than the Norse themselves, and then only in that very limited raiding-related context. No one else called them Vikings. And had you asked anyone in England or Ireland or anywhere else during the 8th or 9th centuries about Vikings, well, they wouldn't have known what you were talking about. To the German tribes, they were the Ascomani, the Ashmen, from the ash wood in their ships, while the Anglo-Saxons called them Danes, as well as heathens. To the Celtic Irish, they were Dovgal, dark foreigners, Danes, or Fingal, fair foreigners, the Norwegians, as well as Gentiles, while to the Franks they were the Northmen, later becoming the Normans. The Arabs, Slavs, and Byzantines called them the Rus, from a word meaning to row a boat, from which, incidentally, came the names of Russia and Belarus, where they settled. The term Viking was only introduced into English centuries after the Vikings had ceased to exist, and later came to mean not just seaborne raiders from Scandinavia, but anyone from anywhere the Norse had settled, like Iceland or the Faroe Islands, or anything connected with them. Viking this and Viking that. Things such as Viking culture, Viking art, Viking religion, Viking ships, and whatever else you can think of got the Viking prefix added to them, even though none of them actually had anything to do with the word, except for a ship. And even then, only in terms of those who sailed in it, not the ship itself. There was no Viking music or Viking art, though there was plenty of Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish music and art. So, as a national identity, the Vikings weren't Vikings. Nor, of course, did they go around in horned helmets, which would have been rather awkward when going through low doorways and a positive health hazard to anyone beside them in a shield wall. Move suddenly sideways and, oh shit, you just impaled Eric standing beside you. And big horns sticking out could have been grabbed and used by an adversary as a handle to pull them off balance or pull a helmet off altogether. That myth may have started as a way of demonizing them, the horns to equate them with the devil, though it really only took hold of popular imagination in the 19th century, largely through the Germanic mythological operas of Richard Wagner, known as Der Ring des Nibelungen, the Ring of the Nibelungs, and numerous artists of the time, who liked to draw his characters with huge horns that looked as though they'd got them from a Texas longhorn, or wings that would have done credit to an eagle sticking out of their helmets. And from then on, Vikings were drawn in the same manner as Siegfried and Brünnhilde from the operas. How strange that they have gained such fame in the popular mind under the wrong name and wearing something they never actually did. The popular image of Vikings as scruffy, disheveled, and completely uncivilized killers and rapists is just as wrong as horned helmets. They weren't unkempt, filthy barbarians, but actually the cleanest people in Europe during the Middle Ages, bathing once a week and washing their hands and faces every day, something that astonished the Anglo-Saxons, who might only bathe once or twice a year, if at all. And what really bothered the Saxons, the Norse changed their underclothing. Now that was just weird. They changed them. I mean, why would you do that? You'd taken the trouble to put them on, after all. Why bother to keep taking them off? You could do that when you had your annual bath. All that work, on, off, on, off. It didn't make any sense to the Saxons. Weird. That does say a lot about the Anglo-Saxons. If a deodorant salesperson could go back in a time machine to those days, they'd make a fortune. And both men and women took great trouble with their hair and grooming in general. Beautifully made combs, carved from horn, being one of the most common items found in graves or excavations of Norse sites. Nor did they do nothing but raid, pillage, and rape. Admittedly, they did a lot of raiding, pillaging, and raping. And they did it very well, if that's the right word. Well, yes, they were bloody good at it, with some emphasis on the bloody part, of course. But while they did do those things, they were also the finest traders, explorers, navigators, and settlers of their day, and were quite happy to trade rather than raid if the opportunity arose, since that way they got what they wanted without loss to themselves, and often for greater profit. There was little point in gaining great wealth on a raid if you got yourself killed doing it. And once they established permanent settlements somewhere, they were not loath to assimilate quite quickly through marriage with the peoples they found themselves among, as happened very strikingly here in Ireland, where eventually there was no difference between Norse and Gael. A good example being King Sigurd Sigtbjörn, who became ruler of Dublin in the late 10th century, and whose father was a Norse nobleman and his mother an Irish princess. Similar integration, of course, occurred in what is now Russia, as well as France, where the land of the Northmen quite quickly became Normandy, and thoroughly French, with Norse overtones. You see, the Norse didn't seem to have any great problem about integration with other peoples, unlike later Europeans in the colonial era of the 18th and 19th centuries, when integration with the subjugated races of the various empires was more or less unthinkable. Damn it, old chap, they're just natives, after all, I say. Another point in the Vikings' favour. A great misconception about them is their supposed hatred of Christianity. To put it bluntly, they couldn't have cared less about Christianity as such. Yes, but they raided churches and monasteries. Those were their favourite targets. Irish monks even had to build special, tall, inaccessible round towers to hide in when the Vikings came. Yes, they did. Religious institutions were their favourite targets. But for the same reason a modern burglar breaks into an obviously wealthy house rather than a run-down, dilapidated one that clearly contains nothing of value, not worth the trouble of taking it to the pawn shop. Most of the wealth in those days was held by the church. Churches and monastic institutions were filled with gold and silver objects, precious stones, donations of money, rich fabrics, and the like. And priests and monks were about the only people who could read and write, making them a very valuable thing as a captive who could be sold as slaves. So, of course, that was where a Viking raider would go. Why raid a penniless fishing village if there was a wealthy monastery nearby? The Vikings' own religion was non-dogmatic. It didn't have rules and regulations. They didn't want converts, and they really had no interest in other people's beliefs. They would have considered Christians weak and spineless. Their turn the other cheek, love thy neighbour attitudes would certainly not have been the Viking attitude. But they couldn't have cared less what gods others worshipped, as long as they didn't try to force them to worship those gods. And if the wealth of the day had been in the hands of, well, the Jews or the Muslims, the Vikings would have ignored Christian churches and raided synagogues and mosques instead. The extent of Norse trading and settlement was unsurpassed by anyone else, founding most of the major towns in Ireland, navigating the rivers of Europe from the Baltic right down to the Black Sea and Constantinople, which often meant porting their ships for miles overland to change rivers, even reaching Baghdad, bringing exotic furs, beautiful gold and silver jewellery, amber, which is rare in the Mediterranean but common in the far north, and of course, slaves. Slaves were a very valuable commodity and fetched a good price in the markets of Constantinople, some acquired along the way, others brought from distant lands such as Ireland or Britain. There was a raid in Ireland in 821 AD, for example, when a large number of women were taken from Howth in Dublin Bay. We can't fault them too much for that. Slavery was common right across Europe and the Middle East at the time. It was the norm, and everybody else was doing it, despite the efforts of the church to stop it. So the Vikings simply went with the flow, so to speak. They were interested in profit, and slaves brought considerable profit. They simply brought what the market wanted, which is what good businessmen do, and they were very good. In fact, under Viking kings, such as the famous Ivar the Boneless, and later the Norse Gaelic Kingdom of Dublin, Ireland became the largest slave market in Western Europe, centred on Dublin, which was no small achievement, drawing much of the potential merchandise, for want of a better word, from the Irish hinterland and from raids on Britain and Scotland. They were expert shipbuilders, the finest of their day, perhaps the finest of all time. The famous, or infamous, I suppose, if you were a resident of a coastal town and saw one approaching, yes, the famous Viking Longship, being perhaps the most perfect ship ever devised for its intended purpose. Fast, able to sail deep inland along rivers due to its shallow draft, able to reverse direction almost instantly by the road simply turning around and rowing the opposite way, which could be very useful in emergencies. If you were going up a river and found the natives had perhaps blocked it, put a chain across or something, or they started shooting arrows at you from the banks, well, everybody just turns around and rows like Fenrir the giant wolf is right behind them the other way, and well, you're out of danger in no time. That was easy because the Viking Longship was the same at both ends. It didn't have a pointy bit at the front end and a roundy bit at the back end like other ships did. It had a pointy bit at both ends. It was the ideal warship, and no town that lay on a river more than 3 feet deep was safe from it, no matter how far inland it might be. And of course the Vikings developed navigational techniques that could even take them out into the vast expanse of the North Atlantic, to Iceland, to Greenland, and on to North America, finding Newfoundland, where they settled for a time. And now recent evidence indicates they went even further south, down to New Brunswick as well, where they seem to have just had a look and left again, naming it Vinland, due to the wild grapes that grew there. That's actually a very interesting example of how what we think we know sometimes turns out to be something else, as is the case rather frequently with the Vikings. It was thought at one time that Leif Erikson had exaggerated a bit with his account of this wonderful Vinland, because wild grapes, well, they don't grow in Newfoundland, nor were there rivers full of salmon, and there weren't any natives who used animal skins to build their canoes, as he described. So Leif appeared to have been, well, shall we say, a bit economical with the truth. But more recently, excavations at the confirmed Viking site in Newfoundland turned up butternuts. So, big wow, you say? Butternuts? Yes, butternuts. But, you see, butternuts do not grow in Newfoundland. However, they are found over 500 miles to the south in eastern New Brunswick, which is actually the northern limit of where you can find them. And, significantly, wild grapes grow freely in New Brunswick. There are rivers filled with salmon, and the natives there used to use animal skins for their canoes. The butternuts obviously didn't bring themselves all the way up to Newfoundland and then bury themselves in a Viking midden heap for some archaeologist woman to find in the 21st century. Obviously, Leif or some of his men had gone down to New Brunswick and brought things back up to the settlement. So, Leif Erikson is cleared of telling porcupines, and New Brunswick clearly is the region he named Vinland. Unless, of course, someone is going to suggest that butternuts are rather like triffids and they can get up and toddle off all by themselves 500 miles up to Newfoundland, which seems a tad unlikely. They also have to be able to swim to get from New Brunswick to Newfoundland, since the estuary of the St. Lawrence River sort of gets in the way. As I said at the start, the Vikings have been misrepresented, and that's very true. Lurid tales of their merciless savagery abound, their wanton brutality overshadowing all other attributes, but are questionable as to accuracy. Yes, they were brutal at times, very brutal, but so too was everyone else. Cities razed to the ground and their inhabitants raped and slaughtered all across Europe and the Middle East, but not a Viking in sight. The Crusaders massacred and raped other Christians in Constantinople, despite being on a quest to fight Muslims, even decorating their helmets with wounds cut from nuns. And they did even worse in Jerusalem when they eventually got there, cheerfully massacring Arabs and Jews and anybody else who got in their way with equal ferocity. Their savagery, even appalling scholars of the time, used as they were to violence, but there weren't any Vikings involved in it. Every army in Europe, everyone, killed, looted, and raped to various degrees, many far worse than anything the Vikings ever did. Yet, strangely, it is the Vikings who have got the label of merciless brutes, despite the fact that they were a little different to anyone else at the time. They simply did it with more style, leaping off dragon-headed ships. And of course, as I mentioned previously, they were pagans, something that made them evil and morally reprehensible in the eyes of the church, so that anything they did was automatically far worse than the same thing done by a Christian. They were demonized simply by their pagan beliefs. Also, it must be remembered that the Norse did not regard raiding as theft. Indeed, theft was what was considered a most dishonourable act, something never done by a true warrior, and a thing that would bring disgrace to his name, while raiding was seen as an act of valour, where risk and danger were encountered, and the victor returned with the spoils won by his courage and daring. If Eric the Really Dreadful had broken into your house while you slept, taken your gold, quietly sneaked out to avoid a fight, and scurried back to his ship, taking off as fast as he could, he would have been branded a thief and a coward. But had he kicked in your door, killed anyone who resisted him, burned your house down, and then gone to his ship with your gold, he'd have gone home with honour and his well-deserved booty, having taken risks to obtain it. It does make sense when you think about it. Robbing, let us say, a frail old woman for her purse, as we so often see in our streets today, to a Viking warrior would have been something without honour, branding him no more than a common thief. The same applied to rape. A rape was a very serious crime back home in Scandinavia, seen as one of the spoils, however, to be had when raiding. To Viking raiders, there was a distinct difference between their women, who were spoils of war, if you like, and thus fair game, and our women, who you touched at your peril, because if a husband or brother or some other relative didn't gut you, the woman probably would do it herself. Oh, and women, incidentally, could be raiders as well as men, which is something that is often completely overlooked. A Viking fleet was recorded as landing in Ireland in the late 10th century, led by a woman the Irish called the Red Maiden, who the Irish chroniclers regarded as one of the most dangerous of the Viking leaders, and one of the most brutal, though her evilness was probably a tad exaggerated for propaganda purposes. No name is mentioned for her, but given her nickname, she may have been a Norwegian woman named Rusla, daughter of King Keeg of Telemark, who gathered a Viking fleet after her father was overthrown by the Danish king Omund, attacking Danish shipping in revenge. She went on to raid Denmark itself, the British Isles, and significantly perhaps Ireland, acquiring a fearsome reputation as a bloodthirsty individual who took no prisoners, gaining herself the name the Red Woman in the process. Being captured by her was decidedly bad for one's health. She was eventually brought down by her own brother, Tasandus, after King Omund persuaded him to change sides by adopting him as a foster son. How nice of him. Tasandus was said to have grabbed her by her braids and held her as his men beat her to death with rowing oars. What a superb example of brotherly love. With a brother like him, who needed enemies? And in the saga of Hervor, we read how she turned her back on normal female things, trained herself in fighting, and went off with her own ships, raiding and pillaging, becoming a much feared Viking leader, showing that the concept of a female Vikinger was something that was accepted, as indeed was the concept of the shield maiden, though that term is seldom ever found in the Norse sagas. But stories of female warriors are plentiful, enough to show that, again, the concept of a woman taking up arms, if need be, was accepted. And there are also historical accounts of Norse women in combat as well, something that I will be looking at in another video. Sadly, the impact of Christianity, rather than improving things, as might have been expected, was to alter Norse society in not altogether good ways, especially in the treatment of women, who had enjoyed a freedom and personal power almost unknown in the rest of Europe, able to own land, divorce their husband, control all aspects of the home, and even stop fights between the men, which they would often do by throwing clothes over their weapons or pushing them apart with a pole. One woman, Aud Ketilsdottir, known as Aud the Deep Thinker, travelled to Iceland with her own ship and some 20 men under her command, as well as prisoners captured during raids around the British Isles. Once again, a female with her own ship, just like Hervor in the saga or Rusa. Obviously a kindly woman, despite her involvement with raiding, she freed the prisoners once they reached Iceland and gifted them land so they could farm and support themselves, which she didn't have to do. They were captives after all, and could simply have been used as slaves. And of course she did the same for her own men, passing it out to those who had accompanied her. She must have been a very intelligent woman, given her nickname, and she became quite politically influential in Iceland, remembered today as one of the great early Icelanders, being a fine example of just what a Norse woman could accomplish. She completely reversed gender roles and was able to do so. That says a great deal. Unwanted advances, touching or kissing a woman without her consent, were regarded as serious matters. Men had no right to physically interfere with women, and it was considered reprehensible to kill a woman except in very special circumstances. In inter-tribal conflicts, blood feuds and the like, women would usually be given the chance to leave unharmed before the men would be killed, as in the cases where, say, a house would be surrounded and burnt with its occupants inside, a common method of attack given the flammability of the wooden buildings. The women and children would be offered the chance to leave unharmed. Obviously, there were exceptions to that. But overall, the respect for women's rights was an outstanding feature of Norse society. But once Christianized, Norse women lost much of that, being relegated to the decidedly second-class status of women across the rest of Europe and the Middle East. The new religion did, of course, improve trading, since many Christians were very reluctant to trade with pagans, that being officially forbidden by the church, and it became easier for them to integrate with those they had settled among, resulting in their becoming less and less Norse and more like those around them, as happened in Ireland, where eventually there was no difference between Norse and Celt, the two cultures becoming one, exemplified as early as 1014, when Norse and Dublin Irish fought together against the usurping King Brian Boru at the Battle of Clontarf, unsuccessfully as it turned out. You know, it has been suggested that the sudden conversion to Christianity of Iceland, which seemed to happen almost instantly in 1100 AD, had more to do with economic matters, like improved trade with Christian countries, than it had with any genuine religious fervour, given the rather noticeable lack of any great devotional aspect of later Icelandic society, as well as pagan influences that have continued even to the present day in Iceland. The Christian era also eventually brought an end to the raiding, there being little need for it as Norse society changed to fit the various communities they lived among and gradually became part of. The previously much admired ideals of honour, unbreakable oaths, and implacable warrior courage that had been a hallmark of the Vikings no longer had much place in the New World. That was a pity, since although it had been marked by cruelty and violence, there had been a sense of honour and duty that was sadly lacking in the knights of Europe, who professed to protect the weak and cherish women, while in actuality raping and murdering on a fairly impressive scale themselves, seldom living up to what the church itself expected of them when they took their supposedly sacred, binding, knightly vows. A Viking never broke an oath, even when, as in the case of Ragnar Lothbrok, keeping it would mean his own death, while a medieval knight, well, he seldom kept one if it interfered with his own desires. He just did his own thing, confessed his sins, got absolution, and started all over again. One could put it in a poetic way, I suppose, and say that when the Viking world sank into the backward-thinking pit of the Dark Ages, wonderful dragon ships never sailed again. This video has been little more than some highlights about the Vikings. Since to cover the subject fully, I'd be talking for hours, but there will be further videos on this topic that will go into more details on specific things about the Norse people and their considerable contribution to history. So, until the next time, goodbye for now. Farewell.